rights movement had been growing steadily since the 70s, thanks in part to Manson family murder victim Sharon Tate's mother, Doris. By the 90s, a coalition of crime victims, prosecutors, prison officials, and conservative politicians benefited from new research about trauma experienced by violent crime victims. They started victims groups and conventions and erected the National Domestic Violence Hotline and led pioneering probes into stalking and identity theft. Wrote Rachel Moore, "The movement's genius, the thing that made it enough of a political force that we now have a federal office for victims of crime and most states now have constitutional amendments enshrining victims' rights, was creating a strategic alliance between those who had been the victims of violent crime and people who had not been victimized but still lived in a state of heightened anxiety." The victims' rights movement was also essential in pushing for harsher sentences up to the death penalty and denying parole. They were also behind the implementation of numerous three strikes laws, in which felons with 2 previous convictions would be jailed for 20 to 25 years to life, no matter the 3rd conviction. The severity of this rule would be tested in California in 1995 when 27-year-old Jerry Dwayne Williams was sentenced to 25 years to life for stealing a slice of pepperoni pizza. Jerry's past convictions included robbery, attempted robbery, and possession, and the draconian sentence led to victims' rights advocates defending their position. People in this country today don't care about Bosnia, don't care about the Arab conflict with Israel. What they care about is the safety of their families. People are afraid. It's as simple as that, said one advocate named Harold Young. The LA Times reported one activist named Jan Miller, a woman whose daughter's murder went unsolved, said, "When TV gives us this 2.5-minute soundbite about the poor soul who stole a piece of pizza, they ask if he deserves to spend 25 years to life in prison. Well, the truth of the matter is, he probably does." The paper explained she believes criminals commit many horrible deeds before they ever get caught. The way she figures it, if someone gets convicted twice, he deserves life in the slammer the 3rd time around, no matter what his offense. Though Jerry Williams was quietly released after 5 years, the 3 strikes law would continue, regularly being challenged, though it was a victory for the victims' rights movement. The problem was, victims weren't always unanimous in what they perceived to be justice. In 1990, Rosemary LaBianca's daughter, Suzan LaBerge, told the parole board that Charles Tex Watson, one of the Manson members who murdered Rosemary, should be released. Sharon Tate's mother, Doris, told her, "You know, Suzanne, that you dishonored your mother today. Every mother within the sound of my voice would cringe if their kid went into a parole hearing to beg for their killer's release. You make me so sick I can't even stand to look at you, you dumb shit." Watson had converted to Christianity, gotten married, and fathered 4 children behind bars. And he was ultimately one of the people directly impacted by one of the victim rights movement's biggest victories of the 90s, banning conjugal visits for life prisoners in 1996. Disagreements over punishments, particularly the death penalty, raged in other prominent cases. While plenty of gay Americans wanted Matthew Shepard's killers to die for their actions, Shepard's parents helped the one facing execution escape the death penalty. Said his father, Dennis, "I would like nothing better than to see you die, Mr. McKinney. However, this is the time to begin the healing process, to show mercy to someone who refused to show any mercy." While many loved ones of victims of the OKC bombing wanted Timothy McVeigh to die, Bud Welch, whose 27-year-old daughter Julie died, said, "The death of this man will be a private moment for me, and a very sad one. I don't think his death is going to help anyone or bring anyone back. If we accept state killing, we accept killing." Death penalty abolitionists pointed to the decade beginning with Clarence Brandley being released from death row after spending 10 years rotting for the murder of a white teen girl who had been killed by a white coworker. He was just one of 78 people between 1973 and 1999 released from death row after evidence proving their innocence was found. In 1992, presidential hopeful Bill Clinton flew home to Arkansas on the campaign trail to watch the execution of a mentally handicapped man to prove he was tough on crime. The following year, the same year that the exoneration of Walter McMillian in Alabama made headline news, the Supreme Court ruled in Herrera versus Collins, saying new evidence of innocence is no reason for federal court to order a new trial for death penalty cases. The next year, Clinton expanded the federal death penalty, which would be emboldened by the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which restricts restricted federal court review of death penalty cases. A study found that before the law, 2/3 of condemned prisoners successfully argued to have their sentences commuted in federal court. After, when prisoners now had 1 year to file, and the average time between sentencing and executing doubled, the sentencing turnover rate was 12%. As human rights groups and legal scholars published literature discussing the nuances of the death penalty, police procedurals and serious dramas included storylines about the ethics of capital punishment. In 1998, the National Conference on Wrongful Convictions and the Death Penalty was held, featuring death row survivors and even the son of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, the couple executed in the 50s for spying. Reported The Economist, of 1,625 executions in 1998 recorded by Amnesty International, whose figures are considered the most reliable, 80% were in China, 1,067, Congo, 100, the United States, 68, and Iran, 66. While linked to authoritarian regimes in other countries, capital punishment served the purpose of controlling black people in America. 5 years earlier, a Philadelphia study of death row sentences found that the racial combination most likely to result in death penalty was black defendant and non-black victim. Black victim cases were the least likely to result in the death penalty, particularly when the defendant was non-black. Additionally, the states with active capital punishment were packed with white district attorneys, with researchers finding a total of 44 black and Latino DAs out of a total 1,838. This mattered, especially when contextualized with the 1997 revelation that an assistant DA in Philadelphia named Jack McMahon made a training tape instructing new recruits how to hide racial motivations for their jury strikes. While countries worldwide ended their capital punishment policies, in America, where many officials are elected, not appointed, death penalty opinions by politicians served as a basic litmus test for voters concerned with crime and the victims' rights movement, a formidable coalition. Nobody built his political career on capital punishment quite like George W. Bush, who began serving as Texas governor in 1995. As we discussed in this deep cut on my Patreon, Texas led the prison and capital punishment curve and influenced the next era of nationwide politics. During Bush's tenure, leading up to a presidential campaign that championed him as tougher on crime than Clinton or Gore could ever be, Texas executed 154 prisoners, setting a historic record. Texas's appellate judges were elected rather than appointed, and being soft on capital offenses was the quickest way to get dropped by the most reliable voters, no matter who the condemned person was. One such prisoner was Karla Faye Tucker in 1998, the first woman executed by Texas since 1863, and the second nationwide since 1984. She had grown up harsh, become addicted to heroin at 10, and was effectively pimped out by her mother by 14. And in 1983, she murdered 2 people with a pickaxe. Her execution date in 1998 garnered international attention, with pleas from Pope John Paul II to conservative William F. Buckley.
Italians opposed to the death penalty held a candlelit vigil for Karla Faye Tucker outside the American embassy in Rome. It was sponsored by Hands Off Cain, a lobby group that's against capital punishment. Italy doesn't have the death penalty, and Italians have taken up the cause of other Americans waiting on death row. Hands Off Cain wants Tucker to be given clemency. She's scheduled to be executed in Texas on February 3rd for 2 pickaxe murders in 1983.
At the time, women were one of 8 people arrested for murder, one of every 70 people on death row, and one of 432 put to death since 1984. If it was Carl Tucker instead of Karla Tucker, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. Nobody says it because it's not politically correct, but there is a gender bias in the system, a double standard for women and men, said Victor Stribe, Dean of Ohio Northern University's College of Law and an expert on female executions. When Tucker was put to death, one of her victim's husbands said, "Justice for Deborah Thornton is complete. I want to say to every victim in the world, demand this. This is your right." The American fear of being the victim of a violent crime made some people fiercely draconian when it came to punishment. But paradoxically, the fear of being the falsely accused on death row, or so desperate to survive that you commit a crime and end up in prison, made others fiercely anti-capital punishment and pro-prison reform. As such, the rights of prisoners were another important topic of the 90s. In 1995, less than 1/3 of people entering prison had been convicted of violent crime. The disproportionate amount were drug offenders. Nearly 2 million people were locked up by 1998, and their accommodations were usually less than adequate. Eric Schlosser pointed out that in the prison industrial complex, the inmates were the raw materials generating billions of dollars for the state. Those who benefited from American fear of crime also benefited from these so-called raw materials being illiterate, impoverished, drug addicted, and mentally ill. The money flowed from correctional facility trade magazines to telephone companies earning billions to the private prisons that benefited from the Clinton administration's directive to house undocumented immigrants and low-security inmates. By 1998, 27 states had private prisons with 90,000 inmates, and their investors included companies like Allstate, Merrill Lynch, and American Express. At these private prisons, there was little, if any, regulation. Overall, prisons turned away from drug treatment and rehabilitation, choking inmates of incentives, while corrupt guards helped organize drug trafficking and turn a blind eye to sexual assaults. One of my favorite HBO shows, in their first one-hour drama, Oz, explored the corruption of American prisons beginning in 1997.
Oz is retro. Oz is retribution. You want to punish a man? Separate him from his family. Separate him from himself. Oz is where I live. Oz is where I will die. Where most of us will die. What we were don't matter. What we are don't matter. What we become don't matter.
I know people love The Sopranos, but to me, Oz was HBO's 90s masterpiece. The violence on the show wasn't far off from the violence in real maximum security prisons, with powerful gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood at the center. New jails and prisons in Texas both serve the local purpose of bringing new jobs and industries to small, dusty towns being left behind in the information age, and imprisoning, black and brown people. So Texas was the breeding grounds for private prisons and mass incarceration, said Andy Collins, the executive director of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, who awarded a $33 million contract to a company to give meat substitutes intended for canines to prisoners. The public was absolutely hoodwinked into thinking that the only way the crime problem could ever be solved was prosecution and incarceration. We should have been interceding at an earlier age, dealing with these kids before they ever became crooks. But instead, we're just taking juveniles and feeding them directly into the system. I mean, look who was behind it all. Prosecutors, cops, politicians, all of them with a self-serving agenda. Hindsight is 2020. 1993 had seen the creation of a state jail felony system, which, according to the Washington Post, diverted nonviolent, low-level offenders away from costly and overcrowded state prisons to low-security facilities for up to 2 years. But instead of helping these low-level offenders transition back into society with adequate resources, this program soaked up their free labor and increased reincarceration rates. In 1997, video footage of a 1996 Brazoria County Detention Center training session showed prison guards kicking inmates in the groin, sicking dogs on them, and shocking them with stun guns. One of the inmates filed a lawsuit, causing George Bush to comment, "The conditions in Brazoria County, from what I hear, were appalling. The law will rule. Let's get the facts on the table." Meanwhile, the chief deputy of the jail, Charles Wagner, said, "I grant you, that film depicts a lot of unprofessional actions, but there's not any real brutality." The Brazoria incident generated discourse about the treatment of inmates in Texas prisons, especially because inmates were being shipped in from as far away as Hawaii and Montana. Texas prisons got approximately $80 per prisoner a day, or millions of revenue a year to hold them. When Brazoria happened, Missouri terminated a $6 million agreement to send its prisoners to Texas, and 2,100 Missouri inmates won a $2.2 million settlement, with 40% of it going to the lawyers. Bush and others disavowed the Brazoria video to protect Texas's bustling prison industry, which would continue to commit human rights abuses and influence prisons nationwide. In the 1999 episode Death and Taxes, Peggy Hill becomes acquainted with a man she believes to be a former student who is awaiting execution on death row. As a frequent character flaw and gag is Peggy's overinflated intelligence, she commits to becoming the man's teacher and ends up being conned into smuggling cocaine into the prison.
I have something to tell you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Good. Peggy, all this time her saying you've been bringing me?
Oh, don't mention that.
This is coke, Peggy. You've been smuggling me cocaine. That's a federal offense. And you know what? You're gonna bring me more of it.
Is this some kind of a...
How stupid can you be? I never had you as a teacher. I grew up in Arkansas. I'm almost 40, for cripe's sakes. I wrote every teacher in the Arlen yearbook, and you were the only sap dumb enough to answer.
So, all that about being the only positive influence on you?
Here's what you're gonna do. You're going to bring me a brick of cocaine every week. And that's not all. You know what else I want, Peggy here?
This is one of my favorite episodes, and it's worth mentioning because during the governorship of George Bush, Texas executed 154 prisoners, more than any other governor in American or Texas history at the time. For a comparison, Ann Richards approved 50 executions during her 4 years. For some reason, Bush only granted clemency to one person, Henry Lee Lucas, who, while falsely admitted to dozens of crimes, was actually convicted of 11 murders. In the 90s, the death penalty had heavy support. One July 1999 poll put 71% in favor and only 21% opposed. So Bush's record was appealing to voters. Bush also trimmed the alcohol rehab program from 14,000 beds to 3,000. Meanwhile, the state's prison systems tripled in prisoners from 1990 to 2000. And in the late 80s, counties took out municipal bonds to build more jails, but they were scrambling to pay them off by the mid-90s because the state prison system had built up so many new facilities under Ann Richards. Reported Prison Legal News in 1996, counties stuck with the empty jails and facing payments on their bonds looked to Dominion Management Inc. of Oklahoma, a private brokerage firm dealing with in-state to state prisoner transfers to help them fill their empty cells. So far, nearly 8,000 prisoners from 11 states have been exiled to shoddily built county jails in Texas. And that's how we ended up with the Brazoria incident. Because prisons were prioritized, other things predictably suffered. According to one budget analyst, spending for public schools was 36.4% of the budget in 1999, compared with 41.3% in 1989, while spending for prisons was 7.8%, up from 5.2%. Alongside this change in spending, punishment became the preferred treatment for juvenile offenders, especially ones of color. A 1999 report said that 75% of the inmates held by the Texas Youth Commission were Black or Latino, and the kids who grew up in poverty and cycles of oppression. Described the New York Times in 1999, among Bush's changes was lowering the age at which juveniles can be sent to adult court for serious crimes to 14, increasing the maximum sentence for a juvenile to 40 years, and requiring a 1-year minimum sentence for anyone sentenced to the juvenile prisons. The TYC was also given the power to hold juvenile offenders, no matter how short their minimum sentences or minor their offenses, until their 21st birthday. Bush defended his new policies by saying, "Our juvenile justice laws say to our children, we love you, but you are responsible for your actions. I want our kids to understand that if they choose a life of crime, we will hold them accountable for their behavior." A piece of 90s media that incorporated this brutal Texas system is Louis Satcher's 1998 classic, Holes. The 2003 movie is a favorite of mine, but the book was much more explicit about race.